Hi, and welcome to Contourcast. My name is Kat Boyd. I'm joined with two lovely individuals today, my co-host David Jameson and our guest today, Darren McGarvey. Hi both.
Hello.
One.
It's all going fine. Thanks for coming on the show, Darren.
I'm very grateful to be here. It's lovely to see you both.
How's your lockdown been?
It's been spiritual. It's good. I mean, you just get used to it. It's amazing how the human capacity to acclimate to circumstances which would previously have horrified you. So obviously, like everyone, it's up and down, but a lot of the things that were really jarring in the beginning are kind of part of the daily routine now and almost imperceptible. So it's been a big learning curve. Actually has led to a period of creativity, which and in the beginning of this I would have thought was impossible. Just like learning to accept what the limitations are and then finding new ways to work and think and write within that. So I would say all in all it's been a positive one, but I'm not absolutely skint. I'm not in a household that's dealing with dysfunction. I'm not, maybe if this had happened 15 years ago, I would be giving you quite a different answer. So I'm aware I'm one of the lucky ones.
Darren, your tweets have given me an insight into the difference between being in the situation I'm in and the situation Kat's in, and the difference between that and having kids in lockdown, which to me is kind of unimaginable. I don't know how I'd do that lockdown with kids. I mean, is that a huge difference, do you reckon?
Yes, it is, particularly kids that are as young as my two. My son's 5th birthday today, and my daughter is 2. She'll be 3 in a couple of weeks. So they are, in many ways very straightforward in terms of what their needs are, but also they have unlimited energy, which needs to be burned, and when you don't have the support of childcare, or you have minimal support, if you've got a support bubble sometimes, which we do, then I often feel I'm not meeting all of their needs in a way that I would like to, which is difficult. But it just, watching Tangled on Disney Plus for the 10,000th time just gets a bit stale.
I mean,
and so the TV sometimes becomes a bit of a babysitter for them, in order that we can work or get a bit of, dare I say it, respite. But hopefully they'll be too young to recall some of the harder days that we've had in lockdown, and it'll just instead ripple out into their growing personalities and shape them going forward, but they won't personally attribute it to my terrible parenting.
There's a real, like, Samuel Beckett-esque feel to your tweets about juice.
Yeah. And you see how I try to braid unconventional things together. It's just because, these for me become the real obstacles in my life are how my emotional temperament towards extremely simple things. So in a sense, I'm sort of mocking myself with those tweets, that I would get so, like, I have actually shed tears at 5:30 a.m. because I've got up early specifically to capture those first few quiet moments, and I'm just being terrorized by a cat that I didn't want, and I'm so filled with resentment about this life form and how little it contributes, that I can feel intensely sorry for myself in those moments. And I think having the ability to share something that absurd on Twitter, it's funny. It gives me that false sense of connection to something outside the house, and then also I can just see the absurdity of what I'm saying in it. So it's mad, the things that can send you over the edge. A fridge that beeps, fridges that are so sophisticated that they beep if they're left open for too long, but not sophisticated enough that the door just closes properly when you shut it over. That's lockdown life.
Analogy for the human condition right there.
Yes.
Yeah, my lockdown has been, I mean, it's dead quiet. Like I'm sure we talked about this before, Darren, like that it's whatever is around you all the time, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? Like there's part of me that's envious of like houses that are filled with people and like, you know, people spending lots of time with their family, like having kids as an entertainment and distraction. But I know that other people who are in that situation are looking at mine being like, just give me the quiet.
Yes.
Just give me the quiet.
There've been times where I've just been looking behind you, you know, when you've been on the screen, and I've just been thinking, oh, is that right, Kat? I having a hard time trying to kind of crawl into the TVs, you know what I mean, just to lie on a couch and not be bitten or shat on or whatever.
So we are going to talk a bit about your new show that's out. But it's been quite a funky week in Scottish politics because we've had Alex Salmond's evidence session in the Parliament. Did you watch it?
I did.
I did actually. I mean, you need to be a real nerd to watch 6 hours of that, but I did indeed nerd out on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I watched it. I was, you know, it was towards the end of the day when my wife came down from working upstairs and started talking over it all that I realised two things. One, it was a total waste of time waiting to the climax, which I subsequently didn't get to see because of those marital conversations. And also, two, there was very little interest in what was going on from the broader population. I'm not saying that's indicative of anything specific. There are obviously very serious issues around there on a multitude of areas, but I did come away from it thinking I really just wasted a lot of time there.
No, but see, for me, this is like, I don't know why, but I find it really comforting, right? To listen to hours of procedural, legalistic chat. I sometimes watch, you know, American Depositions. If you go on YouTube, you'll find that there's a lot of depositions, right? With people giving hours and hours and hours of evidence and haggling over tiny legal details, which is why I like it. I have no idea why. I don't know if this is like, you get this weird thing on YouTube of like ASMR or something.
Yeah.
And people are really into like listening to obscure stuff. I don't know if it's connected to that, but no, I love all that.
No,
like
it might actually be a type of ASMR. Like my ASMR is, I mean, it's dead specific. It's called like golden oldies playing in another room.
Yeah.
Are you nodding, Darren?
That is a very strange fetish, by the way. Golden oldies.
It's just like old movie sounds.
Yeah.
But like they're played at a distance, and it's got like a roaring fire. I mean, it's delicious.
Yeah, it came a point where I had to explain to Becky what it was that was coming up on my YouTube recommendations, because some of them might give the appearance of being like a sexual fetish or something like that. But there's all sorts of crazy ones that I quite enjoyed, like there's ones that's like pampering. So it's like it's just a woman coming in, like fixing your hair and cutting your hair, but it's the noise of the scissors and the noise of our hands on the different materials. And I actually get that when I'm getting a haircut sometimes. See, like when you're in at a certain time of the day, when you're kind of starting to maybe get a wee bit like you might nap if you had the opportunity, that's when it's really heightened. But what you're saying, David, about the depositions and all that, I think that part of that is one, there's a kind of interest in the subject itself, the language, which is kind of like music in a sense, because that sort of language has a kind of rhythm to it. But also it's that sense that there are people around, because we have this deep connection, this deep instinct to feel close to other people. I think that's why, like, we like to go for coffee in a place where there are other people, even when we're on our own. That's why we don't drink coffee by ourselves in our house. We would go to a coffee shop. And yesterday I took it to an extreme where I was watching a 5-hour interview by a psychiatrist of James Holmes in prison. This is the guy who murdered 12 people in a mass shooting in America. And he's just being asked very frank questions about, why did he do this? And this guy is just was on record as just having the most severe mental health issues for the longest time. And he's just sitting there like that, like just answering so matter-of-factly about what he did. There's just something transfixing about it. But then also induces sleep. It's just the comforting mass murderer. Let's get head on the pillow,
Yeah, it's quite odd that we're seeking out these people for company
Yeah.
out of pandemic loneliness. But yeah, I mean, I suppose on a kind of broader political level, like you got a lot of people saying, and I suppose it's a bit crass, oh, here he's back, he's a titan in Scottish politics. He's so much better than all the people who are asking him questions and so on. Like, but I mean, on one level, that is true. Like, it is clear that there's very little political talent in the parliament. On the other hand, it's just sort of, I think that Salmon's evidence was at the point at which people realised this was real, because you had loads of people saying like, no one's going to notice this is going on, so therefore it kind of doesn't matter. Like, between this and Sturgeon on Wednesday, I think there's no way for people to continue avoiding what's going on. And I expect the same thing with Sturgeon. I expect loads of kind of fanboys to be saying, "Whoa, what an amazing performance," and all this kind of stuff. Everyone seems to have forgotten this is all totally inappropriate to the matter being discussed.
Yeah, I think one of the things that worked for Salmond was his performative humility, which is a big attractive quality. If you believe it's real, it isn't obviously with him. We all know why he's there, but that presentation, I think, in the first instance, endeared people to him. But then there are all the ulterior motives that everyone who's watching it has in terms of how they want all this to come out. Whether it be Sturgeon supporters, or whether it be all the talk radio hosts in England now all hailing Salmond as some kind of heavyweight, which is what you would never have expected to have seen those kind of bedfellows. But for me, it was also Salmond's given this a very specific type of framing, which is very reminiscent of how Sheridan framed things many years ago with the SSP and the breakdown of that. And it only takes hearing another framing to recontextualize a lot of this stuff. So what he's done is he's drawn a line between so many different things and made it all seem like there's one intention that's underpinned every single action. And that's very compelling. And I think our inclination towards narrative and stuff like that makes that all the more kind of transfixing. But I think Sturgeon, she's a bit more naturally humble than him. I think she's also a bit more cautious than him. And also I think she's probably a bit more honest than him. And that's just going off of my experience of both of them. I think that she's more likely to concede things and put things across in such a way that even where maybe she has done something wrong, people will sympathize with her more. So I'll be interested to see how it goes. I don't know if I'm going to give up a whole afternoon to it, though.
I mean, I think that there's two things going on. That point that you're making, Darren, about the people are framing that, like, so Salmond or Sheridan or Sturgeon or whatever characters are involved are framing that story in a very particular way. So underlying it is a conspiracy. So then everything is seen in that light. I mean, ultimately, conspiracy theories are about, they are by their nature narcissistic, like in every sense. And I don't necessarily mean like just in the Salmond case or in the Sheridan case or in Watergate or whatever political kind of traditional political scandals, but also across all politics at the moment. So see that conspiracy theory about Russian money in politics. Like, that's a narcissistic narrative told by the middle class about why they have failed to win the things that they think that they have an entitlement to. Do you know what I mean? So I think a lot of the stuff about conspiracy can be quite narcissistic. I mean, at least in some ways, these accusations of conspiracy are more tangible than the ones of the early 2000s. But the other thing I think that's going on here is the way that there's an increased pressure within the media to report the goodies versus baddies. Like, as if we're watching a film, as if they're the goodies and they're the baddies, and that's basically how everything needs to be seen now. And that's just not real life. Like, as we know, people are good and they are bad, and they are complex, and they have good sides and they have bad sides, and they've done good things and done bad things. Like, that's the reality of any situation. So there's two. I just think that they are two, like, very kind of modern things that are happening out with this particular drama in Scottish politics that are actually replicated over a number of years, a number of fields.
Definitely. And I think that the most effective theories are the ones that persist and gain a great deal of purchase, are the ones that, while containing obvious nonsense, also contain kernels of truth. You know, so that this is how Farage or Tommy Robinson or Katie Hopkins, they snare sections of the population, because they'll begin by saying things that feel intuitively correct, like your community's run down, you don't have jobs, the situation with housing's terrible, your local authority's corrupt, da 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 da. And then once people are endeared to those things, they smuggle in all the nonsense, you know, all the Islamophobia comes in, and all of the other things that come in. I think that's a tactic, that's a strategy, whatever the conspiracy happens to be. But there's always a kernel of truth in there that around which all the myth is then situated.
Totally. I think that me and David have said this many times on this podcast. More than one thing can be true at once.
And I mean, this is my supposition, because we don't, none of us know the truth, you know, from all the evidence we've presented, and we're still to hear more evidence. But my strong suspicion is that there's an element of all that in this situation. Alex Salmond has already admitted that he was badly behaved. His lawyer, in an offhand moment, said more than that. But it's also likely the case, because we know, because of the ways in which the Scottish Government has consistently resisted providing evidence on how the process was dealt with, that they have something to hide in how they responded to the challenge thus presented. But that's the way the world works. Like, I know this is a really hackneyed thing to say about getting older, but as we all drift into middle age, I've kind of stopped believing that in these affairs there's like a goody side and a baddie side. What you have is an extremely messy reality in which various actors have done various good and bad things, and they're all trying to cover their tracks, and they're all trying to end up on top in the situation. But you can't sell that message to a wider public, because no one wants to hear it. I mean, I was looking at because he publishes in the stats for the blog Wings Over Scotland, and I think he claims in February he had 6 million page views, which, when you consider the size of the Scottish population, that's a mad take. But you couldn't establish that on that kind of audience on the basis, and this worries me. It's very difficult to establish an audience on the basis of saying they've probably both fucked up, right? Because who wants to hear that? No one in the independence movement certainly wants to hear that.
The reason people don't want to hear it is because it's terrifying. See, when it's like, oh, everybody fucked up, it's like, well, who's in charge here? Do you know what I mean? Like, there's like a sense of, and like when Darren, you were talking about those talk radio hosts in England who think that Salmond's this intellectual heavyweight, it makes me think of, do you know that film Il Divo?
No.
It's an Italian film about the Andreotti, who is the president. There's this amazing scene in it where his comrades are saying to him like, oh, you should stand for president, like, and he gets up and he says, I know I'm an average man, but I don't see any giants around here. And like, see, when I was watching that committee, I was thinking of that, because I'm like, this is actually right. There's the there's the scandal and what's happening on one side, and then on the other, there's probably quite a lot of people looking at the state of that committee and the caliber of some of the contributions that have been made on it, and laughing at our parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the kernel of truth within Salmon's testimony for me is his insinuation about the problems of governance, but not this kind of doomsday narrative that many have seized on, this idea of it being a one-party state or institutions being corrupt to the core, but more the malaise that sets in the longer one party is in power. Because for me, the two deeper lessons of this, and no one really wants to ever analyze the deeper lessons, it's always politics, but for me, the two big lessons in this in life are, one, power corrupts. It corrupts incrementally and so subtly that even a person with good intentions, having become accustomed to the intoxicating effects of being perceived as powerful, is going to be corrupted by it. And this is evidenced in both Sam and Dan Sturgeon's actions at different points. But also the deeper thing is, in life, we really never know how a decision we make in a moment or a reaction that we have in a moment is going to ripple out across our life and across the lives of others. Because obviously we're not all on TV being subjected to this level of scrutiny, but we all have lives that are messy, that such as the way it's been paraded on TV. And so it made me kind of mindful. It just brought into my awareness. It's like, you know, in a moment of madness or a moment of passion or a moment of whatever the moment might be, right? Defensiveness, pig-headedness, you could plant a seed which is going to create so much shit further in your life, and you in that moment have no idea about it, you know. And that for me is quite sobering, horrifying, humbling. But of course, the commentary, I don't want to discuss this in those kind of terms. It's all about the partisanship. It's all about, you know, it's interesting as well how invested certain commentators have become in one version of this coming out. And I think there's a lot of audience capture going on. You know, some commentators have been captured by audiences who now expect them to churn out the same take on the same issues every time.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating, because it's culture war again, isn't it? Really, underneath all of this, there are resentments about different politics, different policies, and they're all finding expression in the SNP through this battle between Salmond and Sturgeon.
I mean, the irony being
And
that
this
there's
is quite
no. Sorry, David. On you go.
I was just going to say exactly what you're saying. It's like the narrower the differences, the more viciousness there is. Like, you know, it's that narcissism of small differences thing. The Salmondite and Sturgeonite wing of the SNP are millimeters from each other politically.
Yeah.
And you can say, well, but there's cultural differences there. But the cultural differences are so ethereal. Both sides claim to be feminists in the most like aggressive terms. And one way or another, they're both missing aspects of this. It's totally inappropriate to have, I mean, the day that Salmon gave evidence, there were tens of thousands of likes and retweets for tweets that said, I stand with Sturgeon. But she's under investigation for fucking up the Parliament's response to allegations of sexual harassment. How can anyone think that that's an appropriate or feminist response to this particular juncture? But no, on the other side, you have all this stuff going on as well, and it's just like, yeah, they both make identical political claims for who they are. We're liberals, we're the feminists, we're the Democrats, we're the ones who represent these virtuous political attitudes in politics. Under the slightest pressure, it all goes right out the window, and they're just having at each other in the most unprincipled way.
Yeah.
Yeah, completely. Like, that's exactly what I was going to say. Politically, there's hardly any difference between these two sides, like these goodies and baddies, which is why they're so interchangeable depending on which kind of perspective you take on it. Yeah, all very. I mean, we've been going on for a while now about the splits in the SNP and how they tend to be questions of tactics or like a specific factionalism and base building within the organization, or a question of optics. Like, I know people hate talking about political optics, but it's style.
Yeah.
Like, isn't it? Because like ideologically, there's barely any difference between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon. I mean, of course, they were once the team. They were once the duo. Like, you would never see them like without each other on the campaign trail when it came to really high profile things. Yeah.
We should probably move on to social class.
We've been talking about this for forever. Speaking of the narcissism of small differences.
Yeah.
Speaking of culture. Speaking of the culture war.
Yeah. It's just more interesting than class. Sorry. No. Tell us about see the program that you're making that has been coming out, and the last one's coming out. We're filming
Today?
this on
Tonight.
Is this
Tonight, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's got the last one's coming out tonight. Is this based on the same material that your book is based on?
Yes, similarly, it's similar, but some of the stuff in the book has come out of things we did in the show, and some of the stuff in the show, in particular, the broad grab bag of cultural lenses through which to construe class, language, being a big signifier, and also a big dividing line in terms of power dynamics and things like that. So there's a lot of interplay between the book and the show. The book is more broader in terms of the UK generally. So, you know, I visit Margate, go to the House of Commons. I've got a chapter about the London Underground and how it was quite a radical idea that a lot of people poo-pooed in the beginning, including Times opinion columnists. You know, just this will never work. It's rat-infested sewers, and what is this madness? And then it became the real engine room of British industrialisation. And so the book's a lot broader. And also the book's a lot more political, like party political, overtly political. It has, you know, the first part of the book outlines the basic concepts of class interest, class conflicts, and makes the argument that these are real, and they're realer than meritocracy, they're realer than the concept of social mobility, and that we need to use this language again. Then it goes into the theme of proximity, which is, you know, looms large over everything just now because of social distancing. But that's when I start to draw the metaphor between class differences and social distances at that understanding, and this concept of social distancing as it's understood now. So proximity, you know, this situation where we have people who have absolutely no experience of what life is like for a lot of people in this country, being thrown into jobs that they're not trained for, and then we expect something other than social economic mayhem to occur. But then as the book progresses towards the end, the last 3 chapters, it's an analysis of where class inequality and proximity or low proximity have harmed working class people or the poor or vulnerable through each of the political positions, the 3 main political positions. So it begins with conservatism and this hostility doctrine that we've seen, which is based on kind of public school tough love, which is very much seems to be a way of life that works for people in communities where they have something to conserve. But when you're dealing with people whose biggest problem in life is chronic stress and all of the emotional problems that come from that, creating a society that incentivizes them to behave better by frightening them is not a very emotionally sophisticated way to behave. Then you look at the left. I mean, my problems with the left are well known for anyone who's been paying attention to what I say. So that looks at social media, the interplay between identity politics and all of that stuff, the role that a lot of intellectuals play, and how activists are always waiting for the next intellectual download and don't trust their instincts a lot of the time. And sometimes we leave it too long before we come up with a coherent response to something like identity politics and immigration, because we're waiting on what the academics think. And so I argue against that. And then the final book's about the center ground, you know what I mean? But none of that stuff is in the show, because obviously you don't want it can't be politicized in that way. But what we do have in the show is what I think, and what we aim to do, what I certainly aim to do, was to reintroduce the language of class back into the mainstream discourse in Scotland, by using my position in media at the minute to try and continue that work that I've been doing, in terms of making people understand that you need the language of class to describe what's going on, and without that language you can't describe what's going on. And if your house burnt down and you weren't allowed to use the word fire to describe what tore through the structure, then you would have a lot of problems in terms of identifying aspects of reality which are quite important. So the show's been getting well received. It's I'm aware as well that a lot of the stuff I do gets taught in schools and colleges and universities. So while it might not win the BAFTA, it'll be diffused through educational institutions, and so hopefully young people will start to continue on the journey they seem to be on, where this language of class is re-emerging again.
What do you think the status of the concept of class, where it's at the moment? I mean, my general feeling is that there has been an uptick in discussion of social class since about 2008 and the financial crisis, and then austerity and all that. But it's still, to me, it's very obviously the social divide that, daren't say its name, really. So if you look at our own institutions in Scotland, no one would ever bat an eyelid if in the Scottish Parliament legislation was passed calling for the equality between men and women, equality between straight people in the LGBT community, equality between the races, and so on, right? The races, you know what I mean? Egalitarianism, equalities as a kind of general outlook on the world. Any politician who tried to pass legislation in a parliament anywhere in the world calling for equality between the social classes would be made a laughing stock in the press. In fact, that idea of equality between the social classes seems to have disappeared. I mean, there was a time when it was quite structural to Western politics that someone somewhere would be demanding the abolition of social class. And it's simply not done anymore. No one thinks today that a cleaner and Jeff Bezos should have their living conditions equalized. And there's no call for it, and it's not seen as a point of contention. I mean, that to me seems like a really profound political change in the last few decades.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But I think where I'm sitting on this is I'm trying to bring the language of class in with an awareness of how particularly the right have tried to discard it, and thus it's created big confusion within the population about what class is and what it entails. So I'm not necessarily coming with all of the other analysis of material conditions and the relationship to the means of production. It's almost like a kind of starter course or a beginner course, simply in what is social class as a concept in terms of how it relates to what's going on now. So we look at things like the exam algorithm, and subtly what the exam algorithm scandal shows us is that the education system's integrity is derived from the inequalities it produces. And so the inequality was assured by the algorithm, which is what authenticates our education system. So that's a way that you can get into class without invoking or evoking a lot of the other baggage that comes with it, in terms of the aspects of it, which I think are certainly historically contestable, in terms of Thatcher's dismantling of the trade unions and the subsequent image of trade unionism which came out of that, rather than trade unions being a natural evolution of guaranteeing working class rights. And when you remove trade unions, you have growing inequality. We get into trade unionism, we don't go into all the history of it, but it's because I'm always thinking about the people in the community who are not necessarily completely schooled up on everything that a lot of other people who are political geeks take for granted. So sometimes it's about bringing in concepts that are relatable, things that are not too politicized. But then also by doing that, what you can do is you make an argument in an emotionally intelligent way. So you have a couple of sequences where you're being quite open and you're being quite magnanimous, but then you throw in the stuff about the army and recruitment and conscription, or you throw in the stuff about Thatcherism and the poll tax, and that stuff in terms of BBC Scotland is it's not a natural home for for that sort of stuff. So for me, it's like you've got to look at it in a way that's conducive to making the sort of subject interesting, and then people are free to explore at a level of depth that they feel is suitable to them.
I mean, I think that's do you know what I mean? Your series has a really noble aim, like this idea of, reintroducing the language of class back into the mainstream. I think that there was a kind of a bit of an upturn in discussions about class during the referendum, for example. And I don't mean that just like pro-independence leftists like myself talking about social class. I also mean that there was a lot of pieces written at the time about the kind of like the scourge of this backwards nationalist working class element in certain communities as well. And I think you can see that playing out today with there's an almost sneering aspect in the mainstream media in Scotland towards the kind of all under one banner, the marches, that kind of thing. There's a real like, oh, they're treated like hairy arse nationalists or something. Do you know what I mean? Like unreconstructed. So I think there was an upturn in discussions about class, but I do think that there's quite a strong Scottish tradition of talking about class in a really mainstream way. I mean, I struggle to think of pieces of modern Scottish literature that aren't about class in some way, maybe apart from like Muriel Spark, like in the Prime of Mystery Brodie, which maybe is about, you could stretch it, right? But like all kind of like major Scottish novels, plays, like that sort of thing, they have this driving factor about like class and our kind of the class's collective sensibilities, if you like.
And the problem is that ends at the door of the poverty conference. That ends at the door of the institution. So our institutions are filled by people who could quote verbatim passages of all of these books that are fundamentally about class inequalities. But then when it's time to actually talk about it, they resort to this vacuous language of social mobility, of meritocracy, and all of the assumptions they internalized through the period of Blairism, where you had these two defining cultural prongs to it. One was the negative portrayals of working class people as to blame for their own poverty, whether it be Jeremy Kyle or the way Anne Robinson spoke to them, or reality television. And then you had the rise of a paternalistic middle class, which would compel them to embark on journeys of self-improvement, but would deal with them in such a way that they were really just informed by the media shift and how working class people were portrayed. So it meant that your social mobility became contingent on someone who went to university rubber stamping you effectively, whether that be in a job centre or whether that be in education or whatever. What I'm interested in doing is compelling the people who don't want to use the language of class, that they have to start using it. And in Scotland, that's quite a realistic aim, because it is quite a small country, and there is a sort of everybody knows somebody, and you can kind of reach out and touch power in this country in a way that I don't think you can down south.
No, I mean, I get that. I think I was laughing when you were suggesting that the kind of that, third sector, poverty, do-gooder, industrial complex would be able to quote passages from great Scottish literature about class. Like, I'm not sure of that, right? And I'll tell you my theory, right? So buckle up. This is a Contercast Cat Boyd theory special coming up. So see in your show where you talk about like how the middle class are essentially, they ape the upper class, so they kind of want to be like the upper class. So you have your the kind of the country estate and the croquet and all that shit, right? I do agree with that, and I do think that you are correct. I think that there's an added dimension now, which is that over the last 20 years, the national dimension of that has been obliterated, right? So partly to do with globalization, partly to do with social media. So the middle class in Scotland aren't necessarily trying to be like the upper class of Scotland. What they're trying to be is like the liberal elites of America, right? So this would be like a kind of classic Sturgeonism. So the national dimension of the middle class wanting to be like the upper British kind of class, British upper class or Scottish upper class. They don't want to be. They want to be Hillary Clinton. They want to be East Coast intellectuals or coastal intellectuals. I mean, even the British aristocracy today is quite mid-Atlantic, right? Look at all this stuff with Harry and Meghan. Do you know what I mean? Like, so the process of like cultural reproduction is still there, but it's just globalized now and cosmopolitan in a way that it wasn't really before. And I think the flip side's true as well. Like someone said to me that Downton Abbey was like I don't know anybody who watches that, right? So apologies if there's any listeners who do watch it, but I've never heard of anybody watching that. But apparently it's not made for British audiences. It's made for American middle class audiences who want to LARP the kind of the idea of an oldie worldy British upper class.
Yeah. No,
that's my theory.
I think that's a good theory. I think that's a good theory. And obviously with that kind of coastal liberal outlook, it's very much braided up with the ideology of corporations, isn't it? It's like we see that with identity politics, or at least how it's been fast tracked by capitalist institutions and liberal institutions, and a lot of the radicalism that might have been actually contained in the postmodernism that is drawn from is completely is evaporated out of it. Yeah. And it's just, here's a rainbow flag on a cup. And I'm sure that has its uses, and I'm sure there are a lot of marginalized groups who feel included, or there are a lot of issues which are now being discussed in the mainstream which weren't as a result of that. So it's not a completely rubbish it, but it's certainly what it's designed to do in part is to create the illusion that vast social changes occurring while the class inequalities are still being preserved.
I remember having like loads of quite spicy discussions with you about identity politics back in the day.
Yeah.
And I get this sense that we've probably in each our own ways moved slightly closer together. Like I'm a feminist. Like I'm not a feminist, right? But I do think that feminism as an ideology has lost its subversive potential. Like, and I think that that's what matters to me about identity politics. Isn't so it's not just that like it's being co-opted. I just think that there was a time where like being engaged in feminist movements and activity had really subversive potential to radicalize people against the status quo. Now I think that feminism helps to reproduce the status quo. I mean, basically my relationship with feminism started to become quite fractious, and when I realized that all roads were leading to Hillary Clinton. Do you know what I mean? Like, and watching that unfold, like watching this Me Too movement where women had come forward, then be turned into a whole industry of women's pain being used to like then be I'm with her and Hillary Clinton and isn't she wonderful? Kind of similar to some of the stuff around Joe Biden and Black Lives Matter. Do you know what I mean? Is that like all these roads on identity politics seem to lead to a re-establishment or a reforging of the status quo, which is makes them not, I don't know, like it's not really what I'm interested in.
When it comes to like, sorry, go on, Dan.
No, carry on, David, on you go.
I was just going to say that when you look at like this kind of like, like the third sector and the way it talks about class and so on, I think they often want to reframe class as a version of identity politics, right? So the phrase you hear these days is not so much social mobility as social inclusion, right? Which is a very strange way to look at social class in most regards. So if you look at, say, the Roma community in Scotland are socially excluded, right? That's quite obvious, right? And that has a long sort of cultural history and so on, right? Where they don't feel included in the institutions of the state and so on. And there was an effort to make sure that their children were going to the GP and going to school. Like that's more traditional social exclusion. There's a fear in that community of the kind of the majority community, right? Or you could look at lots of communities that have suffered social exclusion over the last 50 or 60 years. My favorite bit in your program, Darren, is when you interviewed a woman who works in a call center, and of course she couldn't show her face, right, because she's very likely to lose a job, be persecuted or whatever. And she was managed down to the minute and the second, on how long she took for her lunch, whether or not she could go for a piss, right, because she was being exploited at such an intensive level. And call centers are important for the Scottish economy. Like it's so often like forgotten. There are more people working in call centers in the Clyde area today than ever worked in the shipyards. Yeah. And the rate of exploitation is intense, right? Union busting's intense. They're getting paid fuck all, right? That woman's problem is not social exclusion, right? She's too included, right? I mean, like there's not this sense in that language that the working class are at the heart of the way our society reproduces itself by exploitation. Because that's a much more chilling thing for middle class people to admit to themselves.
Yes. And it's partly because the two levels. One, they might be blind to it. Their interests are tied up in the preservation of it, whatever their ethical sense of it is. But then also there's it's horrifying to admit that you're complicit, whether actively or passively in such a thing, and admitting that, accepting that is about, one, admitting your analysis of society up to that moment of realization was fundamentally wrong, and then two, having to ask yourself the question, well, what else am I wrong about? And these are things at a very fundamental level people don't want to do. And it's interesting because obviously the analysis is always class interests and class conflicts, and people retain this viewpoint because their interests are tied up in it. But sometimes just at a human level, it's a real emotional, it's emotional juvenilia. It's real inability just to contend with the truth because the truth is uncomfortable, and being emotional and being economically insulated from having to, and also you're then, all of that delusion is supplemented in media and public discourse, which is created by and for you. So it's extremely frustrating. We that was one of the sequences when you talk about the call center ones. That's one of the ones that that we strategically place within an episode, because we know that we understand the effect that it can have, in terms of illuminating this issue, because that might be one of the only times that people who work in that sort of environment glimpse for a brief moment what they're actually taking part in, because class consciousness has been eroded to an extent where they don't even question why they're not allowed to have breaks together. They don't realise that the strategy, the open plan floor and all that's to make them all look like they're part of a team, but they're not allowed to talk to each other, and they're all being bussed in from the managers are all being bussed in from other communities, and the people on the floor, they'll never rise to a managerial position. So that might be the only time they see that and go, hang on a minute, what's going on at my work,
No, yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think it's easier in a way to just spend this entire period just slagging off the Scottish middle class because it's the pretensions are more hilarious. But you also said in the program that like this is part of that you've found this, like you're obviously in now this kind of D class A position where you've come from a working class background, but you now work as a writer, as a published author, as someone who makes programs for the BBC. I mean, how do you reflect on that experience? And do you worry that, because you say in the program, like, social mobility is now extremely rare, and it's not even necessarily something that's desirable, right? I agree with that general thing about, like, we're not looking for just individuals to work their way out of their class position. It's such a kind of degrading view of what should be going on. But do you worry that you could be used as like an image of, see, our society can bring working class people in and let them tell their stories and all this kind of stuff, that you could become like an avatar for the middle class's preferred view of how you resolve class problems?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I've been keenly aware of from the beginning. I mean, my Fringe show in 2019 basically dealt with this, and that's where I road tested what became the book, the second book. I wanted to test, are middle class audiences who say they like my work because it's brutal and harrowing and unflinchingly honest, are they going to be interested in me turning that brutality and that unflinching honesty on them? Because that's what happens in book 2. It's not a study of poverty. It's not a study of my abuse. It's an examination of my experience of moving up a few tax brackets, how my interests have changed, and some of the delusions that I'm in danger of internalizing if I don't stay close to the world that I come from. And so I'm very aware that, as someone who has made a name for themselves calling out aspects of the system and advocating for more radical change, I've now become a kind of poster child for the enduring utility of the status quo by some. So that's why sometimes I have to be maybe a wee bit more transparent than other people in my position would be about the support that I have had, not just in my early life when I was homeless and the different services and all of that sort of stuff. But I'm talking about the kind of the money where your mouth, the kind of money where your mouth is, generosity of specific figures and individuals whose intervention in my life at different points, whether it's mentors or whether it's people in publishing, have altered my life in a way that I don't think any amount of merit or any amount of skill or any amount of anger would have put me in the position that I'm in now. Now, that might come across like false humility, but really what I'm saying is I am where I am partly because other people took a shining to me and decided to back me up and help me in more ways than just being nice to me vocally, and that just doesn't happen for most people. It just doesn't happen, and that's the thing. So when I tell my story, I have to include all of it, and that's the reality.
No, I mean, it doesn't come across as false humility. I think it's a tough question to have to face. Like, are you going to become this kind of the middle class's acceptable face of the working class? And I suppose that's partly what in the olden days major institutions would have assisted with, like big trade unions or communist parties, like ensuring that the cadre were kept in line, if you like. Do you know what I mean? Because I've seen there's left commentators that I won't name, right? Outside of Scotland, that I used to follow their work and their writings on class. And then over the years, I've just watched them systematically, just slide into this liberal milieu where basically they're reproducing some of the worst myths around the Brexit vote and etc. So I think it's tough, but I'm sure that by telling that story in an honest way and having that transparency, that'll, do you know what I mean? That stands people in good stead, right?
Well, yeah. Well, one of the problems with class as well is that it creates, class-specific social cultural experiences from which certain behaviours and attitudes arise. Not all of them are virtuous. Not all of them are helpful. You know, I think the only people that are harder on the working class than the ruling class is other working class people. Like when we are coming up in our community, we regiment each other so strictly. As a young man, as a young boy, you know, I was in a jazz band. I was into music. I was into dance. I was into acting. I learned very quickly you cannot be into these things. You know, the whole reason that I became a rapper was because it would allow me to be creative and artistic within the patina of aggression and bravado, which was necessary to grant you safe passage through the sort of community that I grew up in. And I just carried that with me. So there are aspects that I'll be exploring in the book, and I have previously, to be fair, where I'm not interested in this kind of class essentialism. I'm not interested in any kind of essentialism. I'm not interested in this idea if you're working class, you naturally are inclined to believe certain things. Because I know just even from my own family, my granny was a lefty. She couldn't see past Tommy Sheridan. She was hardcore. She went to all the marches. She did all the stuff. My granddad was an Irish immigrant, racist, right? Who called my Auntie Rosie a bloody communist. You know what I mean? And a lot of my time in my childhood was spent with families who came up through the Orange Order, who were mad Rangers fans, and they looked after me and they cared for me when I wasn't at home and when things were difficult, and they showed that they possessed values and principles that I think sometimes in discussions around class and party politics and stuff like that just gets lost. So what I'm interested in is what are the interests that arise out of a working class life, and what do they come into conflict with at other places in society? Because, you know, trying to predict how working class people think or vote just based on the fact that they're working class, I've found to be quite futile. And the more I get invested in a certain idea, the more likely I am to piss working class people off should I ever actually encounter them in real life, which is something I think a lot of people on the left, you know, need to demonstrate capacity to do more going forward as we come in from this wilderness that we seem to be in right now.
I mean, so I wanted to just pick up on this idea that you mentioned in passing there about this idea of the working class virtue. Like, I mean, I've heard this loads of times on the left, or at least this kind of tone of like the kind of salt of the earth, gritty, wholesome working class. Like, you know the stereotype that I'm getting at, which is, I mean, it's incredibly frustrating and insulting to listen to, but like, I think that what it fails to recognize, like all of that stuff about there's something inherently virtuous about the working class, is that, like, for me, what's important about class is like the working class is the agent of change. Like, that is actually like how history pushes itself forward. Like, the working class has agency and ability to transform society, on the basis of the fact that there's one strategic advantage, which is sheer raw numbers, right? Raw numbers, like the 99%, like, which was a slogan that was systematically dismantled by middle-class left-wing activists in Occupy, of course. But like, this is the thing that for me is important, is this idea of like transformation, the agents of change, and like history being moved forward through the process of class struggle. So I just, like, in your book, like, do you look at the power of the organized working class? Because ultimately what has to happen is that means you have to set aside the fact that you don't like people or people don't like you in order to act in solidarity in a collective consciousness with other working class people for your collective interests. Absolutely. So you mentioned like the Irish immigrant who's a racist, the families in the Orange Order, like, actually, like, we don't have to like people to act alongside them.
That's it's a great point. And obviously, like, I do go into that. I have a chapter which basically I went to watch Prime Minister's Questions, 2019. I just wanted to go into the Houses of Parliament and just get a sense of it, you know, and get a sense of something that I had previously only seen on television. And so I went in there, I was in the press gallery, and then when I came out, I started working on the chapter. This was all just before Brexit. And it was one of those days where the usual rules of engagement were suspended because Corbyn was meeting with Theresa May later that day to try and come to some sort of agreement about how we withdraw from the EU. So it was the only day really that I remember in that whole period where they were arguing about things like welfare and the labour market and stuff that, you know, traditional stuff that politicians would argue about. But when I started writing the chapter, I realised what the chapter was about was how this institution was so removed from social reality and economic reality, and that it had form in this regard, and that Brexit was the latest expression of that low proximity to the population in terms of either prescribing economic solutions to the population or interpreting the social effects and cultural effects of those botched attempts. And so it goes into, I mean, I don't go into in this book a level of political and social and economic history that will satisfy most academics, but my book's not aimed at that. It's just about setting the scene. And so it's really, you know, go into the history of, you know, people being hung for fighting for things that are now taken for granted. And then the women's movement and the movements for racial equality, all of these things were resisted with violence. All of these things came with campaigns that said these people are mental. You know, these people are too radical. And then once those victories were achieved, those were then absorbed by this myth of the British liberal society, this myth that's used to justify how we behave all over the world, which is, well, look at all your rights here. This is a society worth preserving. And it's like, hang on, did you not try and kill all those people for trying to do those things? Did you not write into law that people weren't allowed to be taught about gayness in schools so that you could protect the institution of family? Did you not, you know, were people not shot in the street about this? I mean, I seem to have a different recollection of what history entails in this country. And the problem you get is that a lot of people who then go and ascend in institutions, part of the reason for their ascent is that they accept that version of history. So they don't understand they're allowed to go for a break, or they don't understand that they're allowed to be in a union and that that's significant, or that they only have to work a certain amount of hours a week, or they have rights in terms of all sorts of things. They don't understand it was working class people who fought for all those things for the reasons you describe. One, numbers, and two, being pushed into a place where they felt they had nothing to lose.
See, on that point of you know, having no illusions and the hang-ups that everyone in the mass of the population can have, whether that's being, you know, like an orangeman or a racist or a sexist or whatever. I mean, how important do you think it is that people come to grips with that fundamental social reality? Because I think that, like, large parts of the modern left are very alienated from that realization. And what we were just talking about, you know, women don't have the vote in this country because all of the suffragettes were really progressive, right? It was a sufficiently large movement that it included people who were scum. Like, you know, you get all these arguments today about, like, oh, don't put up a statue of that suffragette because she was an anti-Semite. And, you know, I think in a lot of these cases, unsurprisingly, they're actually women members of the kind of ruling elite. And, you know, and famously the movement split once women did have the vote, because most of them voted Labour or Liberal, and a lot of them started voting Tory, and things significantly to the right of the Tory party. But that is the mess of a mass movement. That is the mess of a massive population of people. I always think back to that time, and you probably don't want to be reminded of all this shit, right? But we've all got this shit in our past. Do you remember you made a music video?
Gaslight.
That was dealing with domestic violence from the point of view of a man who was abusing his partner, who was a heavy drinker and all this kind of stuff, and it explored his psychology. And I remember you got summarily shot at dawn. Do you know what I mean, for creating this video? And I remember you got I don't think people called it cancelled at the time. I think at the time they called it called out, right? You got called out, right? I remember you
I was a prototype in Scotland for this sort of thing.
For this sort of thing, and I remember you saying at the time, do you know, I wish I had been called out earlier, because as soon as you are, it loses its power. Like, which I think is a really interesting insight into that kind of people, particularly on the kind of middle class left, try to control expression through this kind of culture of saying you can go this far and then no further. As soon as you breach that limit, it just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're forced into a confrontation with reality.
What happened, and it's interesting because what happened is that video was commissioned by the Violence Reduction Unit. I worked on it for months. In that video, you will find all the traces of research that I've done into psychology, you know, disassociative language that abusive men use when talking about their own behaviour, how they're always ascribing blame externally, the coercive control element, the overbearing surveillance, all of these things, all present visually or within the narrative of this delusional and abusive personality. The truth is, the video came out. There was no real problem with the video. The video was retweeted by White Ribbon in Australia, right? The problem came when I published a supplementary article in STV, which I was writing for at the time, in which I included a sentence which in hindsight wouldn't have got past an editor of considerable experience. But I wasn't working for an editor of considerable experience. This was a new commentary section on STV, and everyone, it was pretty much their first job, right? And the sentence alluded to relationships generally, dysfunctional relationships where there's poor communications. No one knows how to assert their emotional needs. No one knows how to extract themselves from the relationship if they think it's not meeting their needs. You know, it's just emotionally unhealthy. But because the wider context was this discussion about gender-based violence, then it was construed that what I was suggesting was that women in abusive relationships might have to take responsibility for some of the abuse, when actually I was talking about unhealthy relationships and hadn't made that clear. And so then it just takes one tweet that I was victim blaming, and then I'm fighting fires on all sides. But what made that worse, and this is the real mess of social media, and at that time I don't think we really understood how disruptive a technology it really is. It was actually because of comments that the guy who I brought in as the director of the film had made months prior. And then he was attacked by people from Thousand Flowers, and then they mistook a thing that he made in reference to battle rap as a rape threat, and then this was retweeted hundreds of times. Meanwhile, I've got a 2-month-old child at home, and I'm not able to sit on Twitter every minute of the day keeping up with all of this. And every attempt I have to explain what's happened is construed now through this lens that I'm an abusive personality. So I made a video upset explaining what I meant, but because I was visibly upset, this was written about in the paper as an angry video. And then you know what? I just realized I was like, that was when my view of what was coming down the line in terms of culture war and identity and this kind of reification of postmodern ideas asserted as real in terms of how people conduct themselves. I just knew this isn't going to impress a lot of people from working class backgrounds, because if someone like me who had researched the topic and engaged, you know, I met with women's groups, I met with people that was known that I was making this video, and when it came out, everyone fucking ran a mile. Everyone ran a mile. I performed this video at a school on 16 Days of Action, which is a festival which is specifically about this issue, and everyone ran a mile. you know, the paradox of it was, and I'll just finish with this, but the paradox of it was, there came a point when I thought, am I just going to renounce my leftism? Because as soon as you jump on social media, as soon as you jump on Google to try and understand why this has happened to you, up comes, you know, that carousel of alt-right figures who at that time just seemed kind of playful and fun. And it was almost kind of masturbatory to just explore the taboo of hearing people talk about things in a way that they had never before. And it was actually because of radical working class feminists who could see, even though there was aspects of the video and aspects of how I had behaved that made it worse, and that I had betrayed a certain ignorance that's probably specific to men. At the same time, they could see that's not me. The caricature that had been created for me wasn't me. And so they stuck with me, and they approached me in an emotionally intelligent, compassionate way. And this is what brought me back to the left. And this is what brought me back to remembering what my politics were, and that this was just a bump in the road that we were all going to experience at a different point. And actually, you know, this vision of identity politics as it occurs on social media, and feminism as it occurs on social media, is quite at odds with my experience of dealing with individuals and groups who advocate these politics in real life in the community, who actually share a lot of the concerns that you guys talk about a lot, and concerns that I've had in the past. And it's so easy to conflate social media behaviour with what's actually going on out there. Now there's a whole cottage industry of people talking about the left, when what they mean is postmodernism on Facebook, and the left is still scrambling with how to respond, because we were so slow to distinguish ourselves from that, because we were so frightened of the informal social pressure to adopt all these new precepts about what violence was and what racism really means and what privilege really means, that we've just left it to, you know, Unheard magazine to do it for us. And it's, you know, now we see what the effects of that have been.
I think Unheard published some good pieces.
No, I know they do. They do. Some of them are mine. Some of them are mine.
I'm trying to get a grift on Unheard, you see.
Okay.
This is the other thing, is like that situation you're talking about like your kind of proto cancellation. See, what I've noticed is, like, in those situations, and this is very telling, that which is why I think it's more, there is a problem with the left and not just like postmodernism on Facebook, is that even when you turn around and you say, listen, fucked it, right, did it wrong, I need to like reflect on that, whatever, it will never be good enough.
Yeah,
because this is like, so we've got an article on the Contour website about what's called virtue hoarding, and it's this new book that's out, and it's like, virtue hoarding is like, it works because it's currency, but if everyone suddenly becomes virtuous and agrees with, you know, your certain like rules about like the way that things should be spoken about, then it loses its value, right? So like virtue is continually hoarded, not spread, right? So like these groups who hoard virtue continue to act like they are the ones who are like excluded moral minorities, when actually a lot of the time they're the people who are reinforcing the status quo and actually just silencing people who fuck things up, right?
But the thing is, I'm not, I would never claim to have been silenced. I challenge anyone to try and silence me when I want to speak.
I mean, I could mute you right now. But...
Aye. And I run on Twitter like, silenced by hypocrite Cat Boyd. But I think, you know, I'm always, and this is an aspect that never gets brought into political discussion. There's a real emotional immaturity at play here. There's a real core assumption that the people who behave in this way are not currently thinking thoughts, harbouring attitudes, and engaging in behaviours that very soon will be deemed immoral or wrong or recontextualised as some kind of ism within the course of their lifetimes. It shows a real ineptitude, social, obtuse way of construing how progressive societies change, and the ethical sands shift so quickly. So the key is not to to ride the wave of whatever is current and plant your flag in that. The key is to observe every trend and every wave as it arises and truly contend with it, as I try to. When I think about previous attitudes and behaviours in my life in relation to ethnic minorities, in relation to women, in relation to all sorts of different things, the language that I used to think was appropriate. I mean, I'm the sort of person who spots that I was wrong before someone has to come and tell me I was wrong and compel me to apologise on social media. So you have to understand that that sort of behaviour has no purchase with me, because when people start behaving like that, what they're broadcasting in high definition is the fact that they need to grow up. They need to get to know themselves. They need to become self-aware to understand that if their life consists of running around pointing the finger at other people, then one day they're going to find a few fingers pointing at them. And how are they going to deal with that? Because aside from all of this politics thing, it was just like when we go back to it at the start when David was saying, life is messy, humans are messy, we're always revising our personal narrative, we're always adding caveats to the story we tell ourselves, we're always making accommodations for our behaviour that we won't grant to other people. And we always find allies with strange bedfellows when the sight of a common enemy comes into view. This is not the behaviour of virtuous, all-knowing people. This is the behaviour of deeply flawed, selfish, self-concerned, puny humans. And that is my message to the listeners of Contorcast.
It's a wonderful way to lead us out. Thanks so much again for coming on the pod. I've really enjoyed the discussion. It's been really
Thanks
fun.
a lot.
Good luck with the last episode tonight. Hope it goes down well. I expect to see you tweeting.
I was great. I look forward to to seeing the book as well. I hope I feel I have the piss ripped out of me by the end of it. You know, I hope I accept that challenge.
Well, I think that the it's pretty comprehensive. I'll say that. You know, it's pretty comprehensive.
Just on the subject of David Jameson, there's a whole chapter on that. His mustache. I think he is.
Okay, fellows, take it easy, and I'll catch up with you soon. All right.
Take care. See you later. Bye.